For a long time, it felt like Caitlin Clark was untouchable. Every gym she walked into was packed before warm-ups. Every game felt bigger than the last. Every record she broke made the next one feel inevitable. And then everything slowed down. Not in a dramatic collapse. Not in some viral moment everyone could point to. Just a quiet shift. A pause. A strange stillness where momentum used to live. That's why her words hit differently when she finally spoke. 2025, you were a year. Not great. Not terrible. Just a year. And when someone like Caitlin Clark says that, it usually means more happened than we were ever meant to see. Because just 1 year earlier, her story looked unstoppable. 12 months before that post, Caitlin Clark was riding one of the most overwhelming waves women's basketball had ever seen. Her final run at Iowa wasn't just dominant, it was cultural. Every deep three felt scripted. Every late-game moment felt inevitable. She didn't just carry a team. She carried attention, conversation, and expectation. By the time she stepped into the WNBA, the spotlight didn't adjust, it intensified. Rookie seasons aren't supposed to feel historic, but hers did. Attendance spiked everywhere she played. TV ratings followed. A league that had been building momentum for years suddenly had a face the casual fan recognized instantly. And that's where the pressure quietly doubled. Because when a player becomes bigger than the scoreboard, the game stops being just about basketball. Every performance becomes a statement. Every off night becomes a headline. And every season after the first becomes a referendum. 2025 wasn't just another year on the calendar. It was supposed to be the encore. The proof that 2024 wasn't lightning in a bottle. But encores are dangerous. They don't reward repetition. They demand escalation. The expectations weren't just high. They were unrealistic. Fans wanted dominance every night. Media wanted another wave of records. The league needed her healthy, visible, and winning to keep the momentum alive. And Caitlin? She needed to do what she'd always done, play freely. That balance never came. Because when you look back now, the warning signs were there early. Not in her shot, not in her confidence, but in how much weight was being placed on one player's shoulders. The season didn't start broken. It started heavy, and that weight would soon show up in ways no one could ignore. But the real shift didn't begin with a headline. It began with something much quieter, something that would expose just how fragile everything around her really was. And once that happened, there was no going back. At first, everyone treated it like a pause, a temporary interruption in a season that was supposed to accelerate. That's how these things usually go. An update here, a day-to-day label there, a few reassurances that everything was under control. But the days kept stacking, and the reassurances stopped landing. Because when Caitlin Clark isn't playing, the silence doesn't feel neutral, it feels loud. Every empty possession became noticeable. Every close game felt heavier. Every loss sparked the same thought. This looks different with her out there. Not worse. Different. And different is unsettling when expectations are sky high. The Fever weren't just missing points. They were missing gravity. Defenders didn't stretch as far. Spacing tightened. Mistakes felt sharper. Basketball is a rhythm sport, and without its primary rhythm setter, everything felt slightly offbeat. But even that wasn't the breaking point. The breaking point was instability. Because while Caitlin was sidelined, the rest of the roster started thinning out. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough to never feel settled. One night it was a starter missing. Another night a rotation player was unavailable. Then another. Continuity never arrived. Lineups changed before chemistry could form. Roles shifted mid-game. Responsibility bounced from player to player without ever sticking. Hardship contracts weren't a sign of depth. They were a sign of desperation. Players were learning tendencies in real time. Plays were simplified. Adjustments became reactive instead of proactive. The Fever weren't building toward anything. They were holding things together. And hovering above it all was the same unresolved question that refused to go away. When is she coming back? That question didn't just follow the team. It followed the fans. It followed the media. It followed every broadcast, every recap, every discussion thread. Even games she never dressed for felt like they were about her. Because uncertainty has gravity too. And the longer it exists, the more pressure it creates. That pressure didn't come from one place. It came from everywhere at once. Fans wanted clarity. Media wanted timelines. The league wanted momentum. And Caitlin Clark was stuck in the middle of all of it, rehabbing, watching, waiting. This is the part no highlight reel ever shows. The mental toll of being unavailable. The frustration of knowing you can help but can't step in. The weight of expectations continuing without your participation. That's when silence stops being restful. It becomes suffocating. And silence is dangerous in the modern sports world. Because when information doesn't flow, speculation rushes in to replace it. People didn't need evidence to start wondering. They just needed gaps. Was the injury worse than reported? Was caution turning into frustration? Was the organization being careful or unclear? None of those questions had answers. But that didn't stop them from spreading. That's how narratives form. Not from facts, from absence. And once a narrative starts gaining momentum, it doesn't wait for permission. That's when the decision was finally made public. She wasn't coming back this season. No build-up. No emotional framing. Just clarity. And that clarity landed hard. It ended hope. It ended debate. It ended the idea that 2025 could still be salvaged. The season wasn't paused anymore. It was over. For the team, it meant pushing through without their centerpiece. For fans, it meant recalibrating expectations. For the league, it meant a lost stretch of momentum that couldn't be recreated. But for Caitlin Clark, it meant something else entirely. It meant time. Time to sit with frustration. Time to watch instead of lead. Time to feel how quickly the story moves when you're not driving it. That kind of time forces reflection. Because when you've spent your entire career moving forward, winning, advancing, escalating, being forced to stop can feel unnatural. And that's when things shift internally. Not in a dramatic way. Not visibly. But permanently. And here's the part most people missed. Even while she was sidelined, her presence never left. Her name still pulled numbers. Her absence still dominated conversations. Her season still felt central, even without minutes. That's when it becomes clear. At a certain level, you don't get to disappear. You only get to decide how you reappear. And that decision was coming. Because Caitlin Clark wasn't going to let 2025 end with other people defining it for her. She was waiting for the right moment. And when it came, she didn't raise her voice. She posted. And everything changed. The post didn't arrive with warning. No teaser. No build-up. No carefully staged rollout. Just a quiet drop into the timeline. And yet, within minutes, it was everywhere. Not because it was flashy. Not because it explained anything. But because of how restrained it was. Caitlin Clark didn't write a long caption. She didn't offer context. She didn't explain the year. She closed it. 2025, you were a year. 2026, I welcome you with open arms. That sentence alone shifted the entire tone of the conversation. Because people expected emotion. They expected frustration. They expected reflection, or at least explanation. What they got instead was finality. No blame. No excuses. No visible bitterness. Just closure. And when someone who's been at the center of nonstop noise suddenly speaks with restraint, people listen harder. Every word mattered because there weren't many of them. You were a year wasn't casual phrasing. It wasn't neutral either. It acknowledged difficulty without naming it. It closed a chapter without reopening wounds. It refused to dramatize what everyone already knew was heavy. That's not the language of someone overwhelmed. That's the language of someone choosing control. And then there were the photos. Not curated like a highlight reel. Not filtered to tell a single story. They were scattered. Almost deliberately unfocused. Basketball moments mixed with silence. Rehab glimpses without commentary. Friends. Family. Downtime. Distance. Nothing screamed despair. Nothing screamed celebration. It was the full picture, not the public one. And that distinction matters. Because when you live under constant attention, showing normalcy becomes a statement. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She wasn't chasing reassurance. She was signaling balance. But the internet never consumes things quietly. It consumes them aggressively. Within hours, people weren't just analyzing the caption. They were analyzing who interacted with it. And that's when the post crossed into a different category entirely. Taylor Swift liked it. One click. One interaction. And suddenly, the post stopped being about basketball. Because at that level of fame, nothing exists in isolation. Caitlin Clark isn't just an athlete anymore. She's a cultural figure. And when another cultural giant acknowledges you publicly, it amplifies everything. The caption got reread. The song choice got dissected. The tone got reinterpreted. People started asking questions that had nothing to do with the fever. Is she exhausted? Is she burned out? Is this what pressure looks like at the top? The song choice added fuel. Life of a Showgirl. That wasn't accidental. It wasn't random background noise. It hinted at performance, visibility, expectation, at the idea that when you're always on display, people forget you're human underneath the lights. And that's the part that hit hardest for a lot of people. Because relatability disappears when fame reaches a certain altitude. Your setbacks aren't private. Your recovery isn't quiet. Even your silence becomes content. Caitlin Clark didn't say that outright. She didn't need to. The subtext did the work. And then came the comments. Teammates, friends, family, public support, stacked beneath the post like reinforcement. Not dramatic. Not over the top. Just presence. That matters more than people realize. Because when rumors swirl, about frustration, about disconnect, about unhappiness, visible unity shuts them down without confrontation. This post didn't argue with speculation. It outgrew it. And that's the difference between reacting and reframing. She didn't correct narratives. She didn't deny whispers. She replaced the story entirely. And here's the most important part. She did it on her platform. No interview. No soundbite. No media filter. No one twisting her tone or selecting quotes. This was her message, untouched. That's power. Especially after a year where so much felt out of her control. In one post, she accomplished 3 things at once. She closed the door on 2025. She reassured the people around her. And she redirected attention forward. But here's where the story gets more complicated. Because as hopeful as that message felt, there was still something looming over everything. Something that had nothing to do with health. Nothing to do with confidence. Nothing to do with basketball skill. Something that could stall everything before it even started again. And once you notice it, you can't ignore it. Just when it felt like the story was stabilizing, another shadow crept in. Not an injury. Not fatigue. Not performance. Something structural. Something quiet enough to ignore, until it isn't. The league's future was suddenly uncertain. CBA negotiations don't trend. They don't create highlights. They don't feel urgent until they threaten everything. And that's exactly where things stood. Behind the scenes, discussions were dragging. Key issues unresolved. Timelines fuzzy. Most fans didn't feel it yet. But players did. Teams did. Executives definitely did. Because if a new agreement isn't in place, momentum doesn't just slow down. It stops. And the timing couldn't have been worse. The league was finally riding a surge of attention it had spent years building toward. New fans. Packed arenas. National coverage that felt consistent instead of occasional. Caitlin Clark was central to that surge. Not alone, but undeniably pivotal. Her rookie year didn't just boost interest. It normalized attention. People started expecting women's basketball to matter every night, not just during big moments. That kind of momentum is fragile. And labor uncertainty is how momentum evaporates. The possibility of a lockout wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. Imagine the setup. Caitlin Clark healthy again. Fans ready. Media primed. Teams preparing for a redemption season. And then nothing. No games. No opening night. No comeback arc. Just stalled anticipation. That's the kind of disruption that doesn't pause stories, it derails them. And for Caitlin, it introduced a new layer of pressure that had nothing to do with her body. Because this wasn't something rehab could fix. This was out of her hands. You can prepare all you want. You can train. You can heal. You can refocus. But if the league doesn't move forward, none of that matters. That's what made this moment uniquely uncomfortable. For the first time, Caitlin Clark's future wasn't just about readiness. It was about timing. And timing is cruel in sports. Careers don't wait politely. Narratives don't pause cleanly. They either happen or they don't. That's why the CBA situation mattered more than people wanted to admit. Because momentum doesn't come back easily once it's lost. And this league couldn't afford another stall. Not now, not with this audience, not with this level of attention. Everyone involved knew it. Which meant the pressure wasn't just on negotiators. It was on the entire ecosystem. Fans started wondering quietly. Media started hedging language. Optimism started coming with caveats. If everything gets resolved, that is, assuming the season starts on time, those phrases started creeping into conversations. And once doubt enters the picture, certainty disappears. For Caitlin Clark, it meant her comeback season had an asterisk before it even began. Not because of her, but because of circumstances she couldn't influence. That's the irony of superstardom. You carry expectations for things you don't control. And yet, through all of this, the injury, the silence, the speculation, the uncertainty, her message never wavered. She wasn't looking backward. She wasn't panicking forward. She was preparing. Which leads to the most important question of all. If 2026 does happen the way everyone hopes, if the season starts clean, if she steps back on the court healthy, what version of Caitlin Clark are we actually going to see? Because time away doesn't just heal. Sometimes it sharpens. When people talk about comebacks, they usually frame them as physical. Stronger legs, better conditioning, sharper timing. But the most important changes don't show up on stat sheets. They happen internally. Because time away from the game doesn't just heal the body, it forces perspective. For Caitlin Clark, 2025 created something she'd never had before. Distance. Distance from constant competition. Distance from nonstop expectations. Distance from the rhythm that had defined her life for years. And distance changes how pressure feels. Before, expectations were fuel. They pushed her forward. They sharpened her edge. But after a season spent watching instead of playing, expectations take on a different weight. They stop feeling abstract. They become personal. Because now, there's something to return from. This isn't a young star chasing validation anymore. This is a proven star returning with something to protect. That's where legacy enters the picture. Right now, Caitlin Clark's resume already stands on its own. Records, impact, cultural influence. Nothing from 2025 erased that. But sports legacies aren't built only on peaks. They're defined by response. How you handle disruption. How you absorb disappointment. How you evolve when the game pushes back. That's why 2026 carries so much weight. Not because it needs to be perfect, but because it reveals who she is after adversity. There's an uncomfortable truth here that rarely gets said out loud. Comeback seasons are dangerous. Not because players aren't capable, but because expectations get rewritten. Fans don't just want you back. They want a story. They want dominance, redemption, proof. And proof is heavy. Especially when you're no longer the surprise. The league has adjusted. Defenses have studied. Opponents are prepared. There's no innocence left. Every move will be judged against memory. Every performance compared to a version of her that existed before injury, before interruption, before reflection. That's a difficult standard to live under. And yet, it's also an opportunity. Because players who return after forced stillness often come back different. Not louder. Not flashier. Sharper. More deliberate. More patient. More selective. The game slows down when you've had time to watch it. You see patterns differently. You feel urgency differently. You understand what actually matters. That's why people close to the situation aren't talking about desperation. They're talking about hunger. Not the reckless kind. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that shows up prepared. And that matters because the window isn't infinite. Rookie contracts end. League dynamics shift. Expansion changes balance. Generational talent doesn't guarantee generational timing. The opportunity is now. Which means 2026 isn't just about proving doubters wrong. It's about aligning preparation, health, team structure, and moment. That's a narrow intersection. And not everyone hits it. But Caitlin Clark has something now she didn't before. Experience with friction. With uncertainty. With watching narratives form without her voice. That experience hardens perspective. It teaches restraint. It teaches control. And control is the difference between surviving expectations and shaping them, which brings everything back to one final reality. This story isn't finished. It's paused. And what comes next won't just define a season. It will define how this era is remembered. There's something people don't like to talk about when it comes to stars at Caitlin Clark's level. The pressure doesn't always come from critics. Sometimes it comes from belief. When everyone around you assumes you'll be great again, failure becomes unthinkable. And when failure feels unthinkable, fear starts creeping in quietly. Not fear of losing, fear of letting people down. That pressure doesn't announce itself. It shows up in small moments. Extra reps when rest might be smarter. Pushing through discomfort when patience would be safer. Second-guessing decisions that once felt automatic. This is the side of recovery most fans never see. The battle between trust and urgency. Because when you've already proven yourself, you don't want to rebuild. you want to resume. But the body doesn't always move at the speed the mind wants. And that gap creates tension. That's where whispers start. Not loud rumors. Not headlines. Subtle ones. Is she being too careful? Or not careful enough? Is she pacing herself? Or holding something back? None of these questions come with answers. But they circulate anyway. Because anticipation creates imagination. Every off-season workout clip becomes evidence. Every appearance becomes a clue. People search her body language for hints. Her expressions for meaning. And when you're a star, neutrality doesn't exist. Silence gets interpreted. Calm gets misread. Focus gets projected onto. That's why pressure feels heavier the second time around. The first rise is exciting. The return is evaluative. People don't just want to see you play again. They want confirmation. Confirmation that the magic wasn't situational. That the dominance wasn't fleeting. That the absence didn't change the trajectory. That's an unfair demand. But it's a real one. And Caitlin Clark is walking directly into it. What makes this moment different is awareness. She's not guessing anymore. She knows what's coming. The questions. The comparisons. The expectations dressed up as optimism. And that knowledge changes how you prepare. Preparation becomes intentional. Not just physical, mental. Learning when to push. Learning when to pull back. Learning when silence is stronger than response. That's growth fans don't notice until it shows up on the court. And when it does, it usually looks effortless. But effortless is almost never accidental. It's built in quiet seasons like this one, which is why this chapter matters. Because this isn't about basketball yet. It's about patience. And patience is the hardest skill for elite competitors to learn. When a superstar is absent, a team doesn't just lose production. It loses reference points. Plays feel different. Leadership shifts. Responsibility spreads out unevenly. And over time, everyone adjusts. That's what the Fever had to do in 2025. Players stepped into bigger roles than expected. Some grew. Some struggled. Some learned what pressure actually feels like when it doesn't belong to someone else. That experience matters. Because when a star like Caitlin Clark comes back, the team doesn't simply snap back to its old shape. It reshapes itself again. And that transition is rarely smooth. Roles that expanded now need to contract. Confidence built under necessity has to recalibrate. Decision-making shifts back toward a familiar gravity. That's not a criticism, it's reality. When Caitlin is on the floor, the game bends toward her. Teammates feel it immediately. Spacing improves. Defenses react earlier. Opportunities appear faster. But that also means choices disappear. Shots that were available during her absence no longer are. Touches get redistributed. Rhythms change. That adjustment phase is delicate. If handled well, it elevates everyone. If mishandled, it creates friction. And this is where leadership matters most. Not vocal leadership. Not emotional speeches. Functional leadership. Knowing when to assert control. Knowing when to empower. Knowing when to let others stay aggressive. Caitlin Clark has always led through presence. Through gravity. Through confidence. But presence feels different after absence. You don't walk back in pretending nothing changed. You acknowledge growth. You respect adaptation. You integrate, not dominate. That's a skill elite players have to learn. And this season will test it. Because teammates didn't just survive without her, they endured. They played through instability. They absorbed pressure. They faced criticism meant for the team's centerpiece. That builds resilience. And resilience changes locker rooms. It creates pride. It creates ownership. Which means 2026 isn't just Caitlin's return. It's a negotiation between past hierarchy and present reality, between star gravity and collective confidence. The best teams navigate that quietly. The worst ones fracture under it. That's why chemistry can't be assumed. It has to be rebuilt. And the responsibility for that rebuild falls disproportionately on the star. Because stars set tone, even when they don't speak. Body language matters. Shot selection matters. Trust matters. Every decision sends a signal. That's the invisible work Caitlin Clark is stepping into. Not just proving she's healthy, but proving she's aware. Aware of what the team became in her absence. Aware of what it needs now. Aware of how to lead without erasing growth. That balance defines championship-level players. And it's one of the hardest transitions in sports. Because dominance is easy to admire. Adaptation is harder. And yet, that's exactly where legacies deepen. Long before the season starts, the story already exists. That's the part most fans don't realize. Narratives don't wait for games. They don't wait for performance. They form early, harden fast, and resist change. And Caitlin Clark is walking into one of the most pre-written seasons any player has faced. The comeback narrative is already locked in. Every preview sounds familiar. Every headline hints at the same arc. Is she back? Is she better? Is this the year it all comes together? Those questions seem harmless. Optimistic, even. But they carry weight. Because once a narrative takes hold, it stops listening. If she starts hot, it's expected. If she struggles early, it's magnified. There's no neutral performance anymore. A good game becomes proof. A bad stretch becomes concern. And the media machine doesn't slow down to adjust. It accelerates. Every possession becomes evidence. Every quote becomes interpretation. Every facial expression becomes content. That's the price of visibility. And Caitlin Clark's visibility hasn't dipped, it's intensified. Because absence creates curiosity. People don't just want to see her play again. They want to evaluate her. They want to measure change. Is she more cautious? More explosive? More reserved? Those observations start instantly. And once they start, they don't stop. That's why preseason narratives are dangerous. They don't allow room for rhythm. They don't allow room for adjustment. They don't allow room for humanity. You're either validating expectations or feeding doubt. And doubt spreads faster than confidence. That's what makes this return uniquely difficult. She's not returning quietly. She's returning under a microscope. And that microscope isn't just focused on basketball. It's focused on body language, on tone, on leadership, on whether she looks like herself. That's an impossible standard, because players don't return as replicas. They return as evolutions. But narratives don't like nuance. They like clarity. They like heroes and cautionary tales. They like dominance or decline. And Caitlin Clark exists in a space that resists both, which means she'll be fighting perception as much as opponents. Every game will come with context attached. Every stat line compared to memory. And memory is rarely fair. People remember peaks. They forget process. They remember moments, not minutes. That's why the early stretch of 2026 matters more than it should. Not because it defines the season, but because it defines the conversation. And conversations shape confidence. Not hers, she's proven resilient, but everyone else's. Teammates, coaches, fans. Belief is fragile. And belief built on narrative instead of reality cracks easily. That's why this chapter exists before the first game is played. Because what happens next isn't just about preparation. It's about resistance. Resisting premature judgment. Resisting rushed conclusions. Resisting the urge to turn every moment into a verdict. And that resistance is exhausting. Which raises the question no one wants to ask yet. How much energy does fighting the story take away from playing the game? That answer won't show up immediately. But when it does, it changes everything. There's a moment every elite athlete reaches that rarely gets talked about. It's not when the body gives out. It's not when the shot stops falling. It's when motivation starts arguing with exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, mental. Because carrying expectation is work. Constantly being the answer is work. Being the reference point for an entire league is work. And that work doesn't show up on injury reports. For Caitlin Clark, the grind didn't start in 2025. It started years earlier. Every deep shot turning into a clip. Every performance turning into a standard. Every season turning into a demand for more. That kind of escalation doesn't come with off switches. Even during recovery, the pressure doesn't pause. It just changes form. Instead of preparing for opponents, you prepare for perception. Instead of studying defenses, you manage noise. And noise is exhausting. Because noise doesn't care how you feel. It doesn't care what you're healing from. It doesn't care how long you've been carrying it. It just wants an outcome. That's how expectation burnout begins. Not with frustration, but with saturation. When everything you do gets absorbed into a larger story, individuality starts to blur. You stop being a player. You become a symbol. And symbols don't get tired. People do. This is where motivation gets complicated. Because when you love the game, you want to give it everything. But when the game becomes inseparable from obligation, love and duty collide. That collision is subtle. You don't notice it right away. It shows up as hesitation, as overthinking, as moments where instinct pauses just long enough to feel unnatural. And those pauses add up. That's why rest isn't just about recovery. It's about reclaiming joy. Time away forces athletes to confront why they play, not just how. For Caitlin Clark, 2025 created space for that confrontation. Not by choice, by circumstance. And that's uncomfortable, because when you strip away routine, identity gets louder. Who are you without the game every night? Who are you without the noise? Who are you when performance isn't the currency? Those questions don't have quick answers, but they shape what comes next. Players who return without answering them often chase old versions of themselves. Players who take the time to listen come back different. More grounded, more selective, less reactive. That doesn't mean less competitive. It means smarter. And that's the version people might not be prepared for. Because fans often want spectacle. Media wants dominance. Narratives want extremes. But evolution rarely looks extreme. It looks controlled. And control isn't flashy. It's effective. That's why this chapter matters more than highlight reels. Because if Caitlin Clark returns not chasing validation, not chasing redemption, but chasing balance, the story changes. And not everyone will recognize it at first. Which brings us to the quiet question forming beneath everything else. What if the most dangerous version of Caitlin Clark isn't the loudest one? There's a version of Caitlin Clark the public knows. The scorer, the face of momentum, the player expected to shift arenas and ratings just by showing up. That version lives loudly. But there's another version that rarely gets discussed. The one with private goals. Goals that don't trend. Goals that don't fit neatly into headlines. Goals that don't always align with what the audience wants. Because public expectations are simple. Win. Dominate. Prove it again. Private goals are rarely that clean. Stay healthy. Feel right moving again. Trust instincts without forcing moments. Those two sets of goals don't always coexist peacefully. And when they collide, the internal pressure multiplies. That's the real challenge of a comeback season. Not the competition, the calibration. How much do you give to the crowd? And how much do you protect for yourself? Fans want reassurance. Media wants confirmation. Teams want production. But athletes need sustainability. Especially after a year where the game was taken away. There's a temptation to rush alignment. To give everyone what they want as quickly as possible. That temptation is dangerous. Because urgency often disguises itself as confidence. And confidence built on urgency cracks easily. The smartest comebacks aren't loud. They're patient. They accept that early discomfort doesn't mean failure. They allow rhythm to return naturally. They prioritize long-term stability over short-term proof. That approach frustrates spectators. It doesn't satisfy immediate hunger, but it wins seasons. And that's where Caitlin Clark's return becomes fascinating. Because for the first time, she has leverage. She doesn't need to prove relevance. She doesn't need to justify attention. She doesn't need to chase validation. What she needs is alignment. Alignment between body and mind. Between leadership and freedom. Between ambition and restraint. That's a difficult balance for anyone. It's even harder when millions of people are watching. Every time she chooses patience, someone will call it hesitation. Every time she chooses control, someone will call it caution. That's the cost of evolution. Growth doesn't look heroic in real time. It looks confusing. Only later does it make sense. And that's why this chapter matters before the season ever begins. Because once the games start, there's no room for explanation. Plays speak louder than intentions. Results drown out nuance. The audience won't see the calibration happening underneath. They'll only see outcomes. Which means Caitlin Clark will be playing 2 games at once. One on the court, one against expectation. And the second one is harder. Because you can't win it outright. You can only outlast it. Careers don't usually turn on the seasons people remember most. They turn on the ones people misunderstand. The years that don't fit clean narratives. The seasons that feel uneven in real time. The stretches where progress looks slower than promise. Those are the moments that separate longevity from flash. Because timing in sports is ruthless. Arrive too early, and the infrastructure isn't ready. Arrive too late, and the moment has passed. Arrive exactly when expectations peak, and patience disappears. That's the space Caitlin Clark is stepping into. Not at the beginning of belief. Not at the end of relevance. But at the most dangerous point, when everyone assumes the outcome. This is when impatience becomes loud. Fans don't want growth curves. They want confirmation. Media doesn't want adjustment periods. They want declarations. And the league doesn't want uncertainty. It wants momentum. But momentum can't be forced. That's the lesson most stars learn the hard way. The seasons that look smooth on paper are usually built on quieter ones that didn't make sense at the time. Moments where shots didn't fall immediately. Where chemistry took longer than expected. Where confidence had to be rebuilt instead of assumed. Those seasons test restraint. They test ego. They test discipline. And they test whether a player can resist turning impatience into pressure. Because pressure accelerates mistakes. It leads to forcing moments that don't exist yet. To chasing versions of yourself that belong to another time. That's how comebacks derail. Not because the player isn't capable, but because timing gets rushed. For Caitlin Clark, the hardest part of 2026 may not be the first game. It may be the first stretch where things don't immediately click. That's where the real decision-making begins. Do you push harder or trust the process? Do you respond to noise or stay internal? Do you chase validation or build toward durability? Those choices don't make headlines, but they shape careers. The great ones understand this. They know that seasons aren't statements, they're stories. And stories unfold unevenly, which means patience isn't passive. It's strategic. And strategic patience looks uncomfortable to outsiders. It looks like restraint when people expect dominance. It looks like discipline when people want fireworks. But restraint is how longevity is protected. And longevity is how legacies outlast moments. That's why this chapter matters. Because the version of Caitlin Clark that survives impatience is more dangerous than the one chasing immediate applause. And whether people realize it or not, this is the season where that version gets tested. There's a point in every season where curiosity turns into judgment. It doesn't happen on opening night. It doesn't happen in the first few weeks. It happens quietly, somewhere in the middle. That's when opinions stop being flexible. Early struggles are forgiven. Early success is discounted. But once the season finds its rhythm, perception hardens. That's the danger zone. Because by mid-season, narratives stop asking questions. They start making statements. She's back. She looks different. This isn't what we expected. Those declarations don't wait for full context. They don't care about timing or adjustment. They arrive early, and they stick. That's why this stretch will matter more than any single highlight. Not because it defines the season, but because it defines the story people carry forward. Once belief crystallizes, everything after gets filtered through it. A great game becomes finally. A bad game becomes C. That's not analysis. That's confirmation bias. And it's relentless. For Caitlin Clark, this phase will be unavoidable. Every mid-season stat line will be compared to memory. Every performance stacked against expectations formed months earlier. And memory is unforgiving. It doesn't remember recovery timelines. It doesn't remember context. It remembers peaks. That's why mid-season judgment is so heavy. It's when patience expires. Fans stop waiting. Media stops hedging. Pressure stops feeling theoretical. That's when athletes feel the squeeze. Not because they're failing, but because evaluation accelerates. And evaluation changes behavior. Players start pressing. They start forcing moments to correct narratives. They start reacting to storylines instead of playing the game. That's how rhythm gets lost. The smartest players resist this phase. They don't fight perception head-on. They don't chase opinion swings. They anchor internally. They trust preparation. They accept inconsistency as part of recalibration. They let the game come back to them. That's harder than it sounds. Because humans want resolution. We want answers. We want clarity. And when the world keeps asking who you are now, it's tempting to answer loudly. But loud answers often age poorly. Quiet consistency wins long arcs. That's why the mid-season chapter is where legacies get shaped quietly. Not by explosions, but by restraint. If Caitlin Clark can move through this stretch without letting the noise dictate urgency, without letting perception dictate pace, then the back half of the season opens up. Because once rhythm returns, confidence follows. And confidence built slowly lasts longer than confidence forced early. This chapter won't trend. It won't go viral. But it will decide what comes next. By the time the season reaches its later stretch, something interesting usually happens. The noise fades. Not because people stop caring, but because they think they already know the answer. That's when opportunity appears. When narratives feel settled, attention drifts. When opinions feel locked in, curiosity drops. And that's when late-season momentum starts doing its quiet work. This phase doesn't announce itself. There's no single game that flips everything. No dramatic moment that forces immediate reevaluation. Instead, it's accumulation. A strong stretch here. A controlled performance there. Decisions that feel sharper. Movements that look freer. Suddenly, the game starts flowing again. For Caitlin Clark, this part of the season may be the most dangerous, in the best way. Because it's when expectation loosens its grip. People stop waiting for proof. They stop scanning for signs of failure. They stop dissecting every possession. And freedom returns. That freedom doesn't make headlines, but it changes everything. Shots come easier. Reads happen faster. Confidence feels internal instead of performative. That's when a player stops answering questions and starts asking them. How far can we go? What's possible now? What happens if we keep building? Late-season momentum doesn't rewrite narratives instantly. It challenges them quietly. Analysts start hedging again. Fans start revisiting assumptions. Commentary shifts tone without admitting it. Instead of "is she back?" it becomes "this feels different." That's the most powerful phrase in sports. Because different implies evolution. And evolution scares defenders more than dominance. Dominance can be studied. Evolution requires adjustment. This is where comebacks stop being about return and start being about direction. Not chasing the past. Not recreating 2024. Creating something new. That's when teams feel belief return organically. Not because they're told to believe, but because the court tells them to. Spacing improves. Communication sharpens. Trust builds possession by possession. Momentum doesn't need hype. It just needs continuity. And continuity is the reward for patience. This is the phase that never trends on social media. It's too gradual, too subtle. But when the postseason arrives, people suddenly notice. They look up and realize something shifted. Not overnight, over time. And that's when the story gets rewritten, not because someone declared it, but because it became undeniable. The postseason doesn't just change the games. It changes the language. Regular season performances invite discussion. Postseason performances invite judgment. This is where everything compresses. Mistakes feel heavier. Success feels louder. And patience runs out completely. By this point, the narrative around Caitlin Clark won't be theoretical anymore. It won't be about potential. It won't be about timelines. It will be about results. That's the reality of playoff basketball. Every possession carries memory. Every series adds context. Every moment gets stacked onto the version of you people already believe in. And belief, by now, will be mostly set. Which makes the postseason unforgiving. There's no room to slowly recalibrate. No space to experiment quietly. The margins shrink. And that's where pressure shows up in its purest form. Not the loud pressure of opening night. Not the speculative pressure of mid-season. The pressure of finality. Because postseason games don't just ask how you're playing now. They ask what you're made of. How you respond when the game tightens. How you handle when adjustments come fast. How you lead when there's nowhere to hide. For Caitlin Clark, this stage carries layered weight. She's not just playing opponents. She's playing memory. The memory of what people think she should look like in big moments. The memory of college dominance. The memory of early professional impact. Those memories don't disappear. They stand courtside, and the challenge isn't matching them. It's redefining them. Because postseason success doesn't always look spectacular. Sometimes it looks controlled. Sometimes it looks patient. Sometimes it looks like trusting teammates instead of forcing moments. That's where stars get tested differently. Not by scoring totals, but by decision-making. Do you force the moment, or let the moment come to you? Do you carry everything, or elevate everyone? Those choices decide series. And they shape legacy quietly. Because legacies aren't built only on highlights. They're built on trust. Trust from teammates in critical moments. Trust from coaches in adjustments. Trust from opponents who know you'll make the right read when it matters. That's what postseason basketball exposes. And it exposes it fast. For Caitlin Clark, this stage won't be about proving she belongs. That's already established. It will be about proving she's evolved. That the year away didn't just heal her body, it sharpened her judgment. That the noise didn't harden her, it refined her. Because postseason pressure doesn't reward urgency. It rewards clarity. And clarity comes from having lived through disruption without losing direction. This is where everything starts converging. The patience, the restraint, the quiet adjustments that didn't trend. They all surface here. And whether people realize it or not, this stretch will redefine how her career gets talked about moving forward. Not because of one shot, not because of one series, but because of how she carries herself when the margin for error disappears. Legacy doesn't wait until retirement. That's the part people misunderstand. It starts forming long before careers are complete, shaped by moments that feel ordinary at the time but get replayed years later, especially in the postseason. This is where players stop being discussed as what they could be and start being labeled as what they are. Those labels aren't announced. They settle. And once they settle, they're hard to shake. For Caitlin Clark, this stretch isn't just about winning games. It's about how she's remembered while she's still playing. Is she framed as the explosive scorer who changed visibility? The cultural spark that elevated attention? Or the complete leader who adapted, adjusted, and sustained excellence? Those distinctions matter, because history doesn't preserve nuance well. It simplifies. It picks a version and repeats it, and postseason moments accelerate that process. A single series can become shorthand. A handful of decisions can outweigh entire seasons. That's why pressure feels different here. You're not just playing the opponent. You're playing the archive. Every late-game possession becomes material. Every reaction becomes footage. Every choice becomes evidence. And once the story gets written into history, it stops being flexible. What makes this moment uniquely complex for Caitlin Clark is that she's straddling eras. She represents the surge of visibility, the normalization of attention, the transition from novelty to expectation. That means her legacy won't just be personal. It'll be symbolic. People will use her career as reference, as a measuring stick, as proof of what this era produced. That's a heavy responsibility to carry, especially when you're still evolving. But here's the part that rarely gets acknowledged. Legacies aren't defined only by dominance. They're defined by durability, by the ability to withstand disruption without losing identity, by the willingness to adapt without abandoning core strengths. Those traits don't show up in box scores. They show up in how players respond to adversity. And 2025 was adversity. Not dramatic adversity. Not scandal-driven adversity. The quieter kind. The kind that tests patience instead of pride. The kind that forces recalibration instead of confrontation. How you come out of that matters more than how you go into it. Because careers aren't judged by uninterrupted ascents. They're judged by response curves. How you bend when momentum stalls. How you reassert direction without forcing it. That's why this phase matters so much. Not because it delivers a final answer, but because it frames the question people will keep asking. Who is Caitlin Clark now? Not as a prospect, not as a phenomenon, but as a long-term presence. And the answer won't be decided by volume. It'll be decided by tone, by how she navigates pressure without chasing spectacle, by how she balances leadership with trust, by how she lets the game come back to her instead of demanding it return. Those are the moments history remembers quietly, and they're the ones happening right now. At some point, the noise fades. Not all at once, not dramatically. It just quiets. The expectations, the debates, the constant demand for answers. And when that happens, what's left is clarity. For Caitlin Clark, that clarity didn't come from a trophy or a stat line. It came from perspective. A year that didn't move the way it was supposed to. A season that forced patience instead of acceleration. A pause that revealed how heavy the spotlight had become. 2025 wasn't a year of collapse. It was a year of recalibration. The kind athletes rarely choose, but often need. Because uninterrupted momentum feels powerful, but it can be deceptive. It hides flaws. It delays reflection. It convinces you that forward is the only direction that matters. Being forced to stop changes that. It teaches restraint. It teaches awareness. It teaches you the difference between proving something and building something. And that's the shift most people missed. Caitlin Clark didn't lose anything in 2025. She gained control. Control over her body. Control over her narrative. Control over what success actually means going forward. That's why her message never sounded desperate. That's why her silence never felt panicked. That's why her return isn't framed as survival, but intention. Because the most dangerous competitors aren't the ones chasing redemption. They're the ones who no longer need it. If 2026 delivers dominance, people will celebrate it. If it delivers something quieter, consistency, leadership, control, history will respect it. Either way, the foundation is different now. She's no longer just the surge. She's no longer just the symbol. She's the constant. And constants don't rush. They don't force moments. They don't chase approval. They endure. That's what makes the next chapter so compelling. Not the promise of highlights. Not the hunger for validation. But the calm confidence of someone who understands exactly where she is and where she's going. And if you've made it this far, you already know this story isn't really about one season. It's about how pressure changes people, how silence reshapes ambition, and how the strongest responses don't always make the loudest noise. So now the question isn't whether Caitlin Clark is back. The real question is, are we ready for the version of her that came out the other side? If you want to keep following stories like this, the ones beneath the headlines, not just the highlights, make sure you're subscribed. Because the next chapter doesn't start when the season tips off. It starts the moment expectations collide with reality. And that's where the real stories live.